think the moral of the story is that second guess your decisions about if you think someone is, if you have a feeling that someone is lying and is solely based on their behavior. If you just have an intuition or a gut feeling, kind of think about where that intuition or gut feeling might be coming from. And maybe not rely solely on that impression, but try to find some evidence to substantiate it. Okay, so we're going to talk about some interrogation practices that might be problematic, primarily because these tend to increase the likelihood of obtaining a false confession. Okay, so I'm talking about Miranda warning. I'm not saying Miranda warning increases the likelihood of false confession, but certain practice surrounding how the Miranda warning is given or how a waiver is obtained might be problematic. So, the ability to make an informed waiver of rights rests on three abilities. Our ability to understand the words and phrases contained within the warning, our accurate perception of the function of Miranda rights, and the capacity to reason about the consequences of our decision to waive these rights. Juveniles, research has shown juveniles under the age of 14 and mentally retarded individuals do not comprehend their rights or know how to apply them. The observational study conducted by Richard Leo, I described earlier, found that 80% of suspects waived their rights, and that police often used certain methods to elicit a waiver. The first was that they would establish rapport before giving a warning, so that the person was felt comfortable with the interviewer and reluctant to invoke their right. Sometimes the importance of the rights would be minimized, or they might present themselves as an ally to the source. Again, making them feel like they didn't need to invoke their right. Leo also found that individuals without a felony record were more likely to waive their rights than those with experience dealing with the criminal justice system. So this is a problem, right? The hardened criminals know to not waive it. The people who are not experienced think that maybe they should. Which group do you think is more likely to actually be guilty? It's probably the hardened criminals, the ones who've done this, been around the block before. One experimental study found that innocent, I forgot about this slide, sorry. That innocent, it was an experimental study. Innocent participants were more likely to waive their rights than guilty participants, 81 to 36%, excuse me. Innocent participants stated they waived their rights because they did nothing wrong or had nothing to hide. So this is a big thing that we're going to see come up again. People who are innocent say, I have nothing to hide, so why should I invoke my rights? I have nothing to hide. I'm going to be exonerated. I'm going to play along for now because I know I'm going to be exonerated later. This is a belief that a lot of these innocent individuals have. So, of course, the issue with the Miranda warning, it's not that, we don't give it, obviously, but it's that it's important that the warning be fully explained to individuals, particularly those who we think might not fully understand them. As we're going to see, police practice in England involves a very full and thorough explanation of the rights, and they are absolutely prohibited from trying to convince suspects to waive their rights. So if we have someone who's susceptible to providing a waiver because they don't understand the rights, then perhaps this needs to be explained to them. Because then these are the very people who we're going to see are most susceptible to providing a false confession. Okay, this was just some information about people waiving who waived their rights more often. Okay, another big problem is what we talked about earlier, parts of theme development, which are called minimization. So This, in minimization, we said that we develop a rationale for why the suspect committed the crime. It makes it easier for the suspect to confess. Now, this is not an explicit promise of leniency. We know that making an explicit promise of leniency will produce a confession that's inadmissible in the court of law. And of course, that's different from a plea deal, where the source has a benefit of legal counsel. However, one study found that people may infer from use of these minimization techniques that they will get leniency. Even though an explicit promise is not made, they might say something like, things will go easier on you if you confess. People will infer that the interviewer will make it easier on them, that the punishment will be less if they confess. So here was one study used that same method we talked about earlier, where we had people who were guilty and people who were innocent. And this found that these people were interviewed or interrogated using one of 4 methods. They were no tactic was used, they were just questioned about what happened. Minimization was used here. Here, they were offered an explicit deal. If you tell us what happened, then we'll let you off the hook. Here, minimization was used in addition to a deal. So what we see here, there was a greater number of false confessions when the minimization plus the deal was offered. And interestingly, there were more false confessions when the minimization alone was used than when an actual explicit deal was made. So we can see that this is powerful. 18% of false confessions, 81% true confessions. So that this is quite powerful to get someone to go along with it. Because this induces a great deal of pressure on the source to provide a confession. In another study, using the same paradigm, some people were interviewed using minimization or maximization techniques. Maximization is kind of like the 3rd degree. If you don't confess, something bad's going to happen. Now, there are with minimization and maximization, there's some parts of these strategies that involve a manipulation of the source's perception of the consequences. So with minimization, we stress the benefit of cooperation, downplay consequences, provide face-saving excuses for having committed the crime, minimize the seriousness of the offense. All of these things make the source believe that there will be fewer consequences if they confess. With maximization, exaggerating the consequences if they don't confess, or saying that if they don't confess, then they'll let someone else testify against you, and you won't get any leniency. So they compared these techniques, these aspects of minimization and maximization that manipulate the source's perception of the consequences, with these techniques that don't manipulate the perception of the consequences. And what they found was that when their perception of consequences was manipulated, there were 42% false confessions, 14 false confessions, 27 true confessions, versus only half that when consequences were not manipulated. So people who didn't commit the crime will confess to the crime when they believe that it will go easier on them if they do. Now we're going to move on to talk about how some interview techniques might impact a source's ability to accurately recall details. So it's really important for us to consider memory when we study interviews, and to study the methods that may alter accurate recollection of events. So those who study memory know that when we remember something, it's not like reading, it's not like going to the library and pulling a book off the shelf and finding a particular passage. Every time you put that book back and come back to it, the passage will be exactly the same. Our memory does not work that way. Every time we retrieve a memory, we actively reconstruct it. That memory is different than the way it was before. So every time you remember something, what you remember is different than the last time you remembered it. So the conditions under which we retrieve a memory or recall information will affect the information itself. Now, obviously, this is really important in a interview, because we want people to be able to accurately retrieve information. We've been talking about people lying, but we want people who want to tell us the truth to actually accurately remember the information that they're telling us about. We don't want to have memory errors in the source's statement. The problem is that interviewers have an enormous potential to influence how the memory is reconstructed. There were notorious cases in the 90s of psychotherapists who would help adults remember repressed memories of child abuse that never occurred, and it was merely through the power of suggestion. With the McMartin preschool case I mentioned, many of those children came to actually believe that they had been submitted to some of these bizarre acts. So memory, interviewers can affect memory retrieval through three ways: the misinformation effect, source monitoring errors, and reality monitoring errors. So there was a really famous series of studies by Elizabeth Loftus, where she would have people witness an event, like a car crash. So say the car ran a stop sign. Then, after the person witnessed the event, they were provided with post-event misinformation. For example, they might have been told that it was a yield sign, not a stop sign. Then later, when they have to retrieve that information and give a statement, the misinformation became incorporated into their statement. They said that it was a yield sign and not a stop sign. Now, they weren't lying. They actually remembered the yield sign rather than the stop sign. So this is called the misinformation effect, where sources are led to recall inaccurate details about an event. Now, how does this happen in an interview? Well, it can happen because interviewers can provide sources with post-event misinformation if they ask leading questions. It's particularly problematic if this information is contrary to the source's previous statement. If the source said the car was blue, but then they are later asked, where did you see the green car? Then that post-event misinformation might alter their memory. They may incorporate it into their statement later on when they have to testify or give other statements. That information has now changed. The effect of this is strengthened when the leading questions are repeated. So we can see that leading questions are problematic in an interview for memory. Another way that interviewers might mess with someone's memory about something is through what we call source monitoring errors. So we know that when we learn information about an event, the content of what happened and the source of that information are stored separately in the brain. So we might, if you've ever thought you remember something from your childhood, only to be told that you were not even there, but you were just told about it. I'm sure that's happened to all of us. There's certain childhood events that I can distinctly remember, but my mom said, no, you were there, or you weren't there, but you heard the story. That's source monitoring errors. It's behind cases of unintentional plagiarism, or retelling stories that you read about in a novel but thought you might have heard about on the news. So, did I hear about the crime from the news or from my husband? Do I know about the rope from the interviewer or because there actually was a rope? So we don't know where we learned information, or we forget, or we misattribute where we learned information from. So the problem here is that the source is led to recall correct or incorrect details of an event that he or she did not experience. So how does this happen? The interviewer asks leading questions that introduces entirely new details that were previously unknown to the source. Later, the source may be unable to distinguish whether they knew the detail from experience or from the interviewer. So for example, if the interviewer introduces information about the murder weapon, the source may later be unable to remember if he was the one who brought up the murder weapon or the interviewer did. The source may tell himself that if he knew about the murder weapon, perhaps he knows about other details. So this could be a problem with the alternative question or choice question. Did you steal the car before you went to the store or after you left the store? Again, we're introducing new details to the source. And then we have reality monitoring. So this is where we're not sure if the source of the information that we have in our brain is from something we actually experienced or something we just imagine. So here, we think about if you ever, and I do this all the time, that I think to myself, I need to remind my husband to go to the store and get so-and-so, right? I mean, I think about telling him, and I think about what I'm going to say, and then later on, I think I told him. I said, didn't I tell you to go to the store? And he's like, no, you never told me. Well, I just thought about it. I imagined telling him, but I remember telling you. It's a source of all sorts of marital problems, I'm absolutely sure. But this is reality monitoring. Did I remind you to buy the milk, or did I just think about it? Did I commit the crime or just imagine doing it? Now, you think that no one's going to imagine committing a whole crime that they didn't commit. Well, so this is a famous study done by Elizabeth Loftus. So what they did was they got a bunch of participants come in, they asked the parents, tell me some things that happened to this kid when they were 5. And so they had about 3 true events for each participant, things that happened to them when they were a kid. So each participant was told, I'm going to tell you about some events that your mom told me about. I want you to try to remember and tell me what happened. So they'll go through each of these true events that were specific to each participant, but then they tack on a 4th event, which is false. And everybody is told about this false event. That they were lost in the mall when they were 5, and an old lady found them and took them back to their mom. Now, they were asked to remember it right away, and then they were said, go home, think about it, and come back and tell me if you can remember. About a 4th remembered being lost in the mall. Now, their parents had already told the interviewer that they were never lost in the mall, but they remembered having been lost in the mall. This was another study that's even more important to what we're talking about. Here, the study was done in the same way, except that for half of participants, the false event was committing a criminal act, either assault, theft, or theft with assault. And half of them were told about a non-criminal act. Now, they were asked about, these were events that were supposedly committed or experienced when they were teenagers, not 5 years old, but teenagers. So they were interviewed 3 times, each time over a period of 3 weeks, and each time they were told, try to remember. 73% of these people who were told they committed a criminal act falsely remembered having committed a criminal act when they were teenagers. Those people who falsely remembered having committed a criminal act remembered 73 details about that act on average. So if we think that people cannot convince themselves they committed a crime that they just imagined, this is pretty compelling information. Of course, this was done in an experimental analog study. So, the source develops rich false memories of an event that didn't happen. According to Elizabeth Loftus, this occurs because there are social demands made by the interviewer to remember. The interviewer encourages memory reconstruction. So if the source says no, it doesn't happen, the interviewer encourages them to imagine it having happened, or speculate it. If it did happen, then what? And then discouraging reality monitoring. So all the time we try to distinguish. When I tried to decide, did I tell my husband to go get the stuff from the store or not? I try really hard to distinguish the imagination from the memory, and there are cues to that, but memories tend to be more rich in detail. And so we're always reality monitoring. We're always trying to determine, is this a real memory or not? If an interviewer discourages the use of reality monitoring, then people are more likely to have this false memory. Okay. So who is more suggestible to developing memory errors? Youth, young people, people who are mentally retarded or borderline mentally retarded, and those with mental illnesses, particularly dissociative disorders, where people feel kind of out of touch with reality. So bottom line is, it's best as an interviewer to not introduce information that the source has not already told you about, or introduce contradictory information to avoid leading questions. Okay, another problematic interview method is the false evidence ploy, where the police present evidence, say they have evidence, but they really do not. And this has been shown to be a cause of false confession. So here's one study in particular. In this situation, people came in, they were told to do a reaction time study, and they were told they had to press a bunch of keys on a keyboard, and they said, they were warned, do not press the Alt key or you'll cause the computer to crash. Well, so the person's sitting there doing their business, and all of a sudden the computer crashes, and they're accused of having pressed this key. So in this situation, nobody presses the key, really. They're all innocent. But they're interrogated using one of two ways. In one way, they're told someone else saw them press the key. In the other way, they're not told that anyone saw them press the key. People who are told that there was a witness, 100% of people, when they were subjected to a fast-paced interview, I'm sorry, not 100%. This is not proof. Oh, this is percentage. Excuse me. 100% of them, all of them, said that they pressed the Alt key when they didn't. 89% of them who were exposed to a slow-paced interview said that they pressed the Alt key. False evidence can be very compelling. So if the police tells you someone saw you do it, that can be very compelling. Or we have evidence that you did it. Or you failed the polygraph test that you took when they didn't. Another study found that even when police use the evidence bluff, where they say, we have evidence, we haven't tested it yet, but it would be good for you to tell us the truth now before we do, in case it implicates you, that can also induce false confessions. The issue, and you wouldn't think it would, right? You think that the innocent person would say, okay, well, fine, go test your evidence. But what they tend to think is that the evidence will exonerate them. I'm going to alleviate the interviewer pressure now by telling you what you want to know, what you want me to say, because I know that the evidence is going to exonerate me. So the confession becomes a short-term solution. In Leo's observational study, he found that false evidence ploy was used 30% of the time. So not a whole lot. So how does this work? Because this evidence is overly compelling to the source. It's really hard to maintain your position if you believe they have evidence. We've seen that when the police have true evidence against an actually guilty person, that they're really more likely to confess. But this also works against the innocent person. And obviously that evidence would be false. It can also affect their memory through the processes we just talked about. All right, so who is, I just just recommend that this is a bad idea in general to use this ploy. All right, who is at risk for giving a false confession? So we talked about some of the characteristics of the interview, but there are characteristics of people who might make them more likely to give a false confession. One is people who are sleep deprived. We know there's not any research that has directly looked at false confessions from sleep deprived versus non-sleep deprived people. But the research that has been done on sleep deprivation shows that it vastly impacts and impairs our functioning, our ability to make adaptive decisions. So in that case, we our judgment is affected about what we say to an interviewer. These people are also more likely to be suggestible to influence and perhaps to develop false memories. We know that people who have a personality trait in so that they're compliant in response to authority, these people are more likely to falsely confess. They're eager to please and to avoid confrontation and conflict. Age. Youth are more compliant, suggestible, and susceptible to social influence and interrogator pressure. They don't understand the Miranda warnings, as we talked about earlier. They're only concerned with the short-term situation.